Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video of myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is just a quick video that I thought I'd do concerning an announcement from the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Syrskyi, who has said that the Russian troops have been defeated near Sumy, redeploying to another direction. So the idea is that the Russian forces have abandoned their offensive in Sumy Oblast after 2 months without territorial gains, with elite paratroopers and marines now redeploying to the Zaporizhia direction, as according to the Euromaidan press. I read this very short article because I'm interested in this idea of a side being defeated in battle. We don't see these pitched battles like you would expect in previous wars, right? Second World War and whatnot. We have a sprawling front line where there are inching gains, and it's difficult to see any individual part of the front line as like a distinct battle. So you can say the Ukrainians lost the Battle of Bakhmut, right? Where you've got a town and they lose that town. And so you can maybe have some idea, and this is just semantics, right? But I think there might be an element of being able to use this as some kind of PR win, right? So areas of the front line are not distinct from other areas because one long contiguous front line. But somewhere like Sumy, you have this area, and you can just see on Andrew Perpetua's map this kind of light area up here where Ukraine attacked into here, and it had this incursion into Kursk. Now, you know it was never going to last forever. Not wholly sure what the definite objectives were, but the objectives we understood would be to divert troops away from the front line and to hit some strategic objectives there. And I mean that strategically because of there was an element of hitting some logistics, railway, gas, other sorts of things that had an effect on Russia's ability to, commit the wider war, prosecute the wider war, and so on and so forth, and attrition of troops and attrition of equipment. In the end, the Ukrainians were beaten back, but probably they lasted there longer than I thought they would. Unfortunately, the withdrawal from Kursk, operational withdrawals are never going to be easy, but they did lose a lot of equipment there. So the end was a bit of a disaster. Rubicon, the Russian drone unit, did a very good job of taking out Ukrainian logistics. And because the front wasn't as wide as they wanted it to be, so if I'm going to draw on the map here, and this is going to kind of lead on to what I'm going to say later, I'm going to draw on the map so it gives you an idea of what I'm trying to say. So the Ukrainians moved up into Russia, did it go as far as Guevos? They got Syrskyi. I think it sort of went maybe this far, only roughly sort of doing this, something like this. And then they tried to expand over Glushkovo and in this area here. So they really wanted all of that. And that's along the River Seine, and they really wanted Koronevo as well. So effectively, they wanted it to look like that, but they were unable to succeed in this area, and that meant that they were unable to take Koronevo. But they had pretty good success in taking this area. But when the Russians started putting pressure on them, they only needed to really hammer away at their logistics. And so there were only several routes into the Kursk Oblast that, as soon as they kind of interdicted, or not interdicted, as soon as their drone teams, as they were squeezing these front lines, so it got narrower and narrower, they were basically able to just hammer the Ukrainian logistics around here. And then that meant that the Ukrainians were unable to supply their troops effectively. It's a road of death, and they started losing an absolute ton of equipment, and then they withdrew and lost more equipment, right? So you could say, okay, this was was it a battle? Was it a victory? Well, it was actually for both sides at different points. You could depends what your metrics of success are, but you could draw a conclusion that the Ukrainians succeeded in what they wanted to achieve to some degree in going into Kursk, and then the Russians succeeded in pushing them out. And then what you have had is this push south into Sumy, where the Russians continued to push them out and have gone into Sumy. And we can see this as something of a kind of distinct sort of battle, if you like, in a way that, they had the objective to kind of push down further. So as you can see, here is the border. And the Russians are presently around here. They've been pushed back somewhat. That's where they presently are. They were hoping to, in fact, at one point, they were sort of down here, just moving into this forested area. And they were kind of pushing much further down around here as well. And what they're wanting to do is kind of move through this forest area, probably from that direction. It would have been quite difficult to come across the flat grounds here to approach the forest, but possibly coming from the north as well. Start taking this forested area and then get close enough. It wasn't a case of taking the city of Sumy, but they wanted to get artillery close enough to Sumy that they could throw artillery shells and make it unlivable in Sumy, rather like they have done in Kherson. So they wanted, my opinion is that they wanted to do to Sumy what they've done to Kherson. So then the Ukrainians sent a bunch of troops to try and stop this happening, and a number of different units. And they have started pushing the Russians back. And if we just zoom in here, they retook Kindrativka. So really, I forget exactly how far the Russians had got south into the Sumy region, but it certainly would have looked something like that. And they've been pushed back, losing Kindrativka, Andriivka, looking like they're going to lose Oleksandr, and then a few other places. Vrachina as well has just been liberated by the Ukrainians. And they have lost quite a lot of troops in this area and equipment and so on and so forth. They have, sorry, I'm sort of flipping in and out. It sometimes has a mind of its own. The Ukraine is also pushing back a little bit. They pushed back in Bezalivka. They've retaken that. And obviously fighting in and around Tetkino over here, actually over the border. And still having some interactions with the Russians over here near Guevo, near Gornau Monastery and whatnot in the Kursk region there. Okay, now what the Euromaidan Press article says is Ukrainian Armed Forces Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi said in an interview on RBC that the Russian forces have suffered defeat in the Sumy direction and are now redeploying troops to other fronts. So this then starts looking like an actual defeat, whereby if it's true the Russians are pulling out their troops, especially if they're crack troops from here because they need them elsewhere, then that is them giving up on their objectives of trying to get down close enough to Sumy to hit it with artillery. In other words, they failed in their objectives, and that is a failure. That is effectively a defeat. Russian forces launched a cross-border offensive into Ukraine's Sumy Oblast in early 2025, aiming to counter Ukrainian advances in Kursk. Despite initial Russian territorial gains and sustained attacks, Ukrainian forces have halted the Russian advance by mid-2025, stabilizing the front line and conducting active defense and counterattacks in the Oblast. Syrskyi said, in Sumy Oblast, the enemy, Russian forces, has suffered defeat. So actually, that is an explicit claim that they have been defeated here. The Ukrainian commander said that Russia had concentrated a powerful grouping in the Sumy Oblast, including elite units, despite the fact that, quote, despite the fact that truly powerful grouping was concentrated there from the best Russian units, paratroopers, Marines, and the best motorized rifle units of the ground forces, the enemy has had no success in the last 2 months. On the contrary, it's lost several settlements. Syrskyi highlighted the failure of Russia's most recent offensive attempts. The latest Russian effort to advance near Stepna and Novokonstantinivka ended in complete failure, according to the commander. The Russian forces were destroyed, thrown back beyond the state border, Syrskyi said. Ukrainian forces continue their advance in the direction while Russians have begun withdrawing troops from Sumy Oblast. Quote, the Russian forces, understanding the futility of this direction of its actions, is now transferring units from there to other directions, mainly to Zaporizhia, Syrskyi concluded. The commander previously said in late June that Ukrainian defenders had managed to stop Russian forces in Sumy Oblast. The Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, reported that Ukrainian forces achieved certain successes in northern Sumy Oblast. So what Syrskyi was referring to there is they've also tried, the Russians, to come down south into Stepny and Novokonstantinivka here, just south of the border, trying to widen that bridgehead, widen the whole sector, really, and have failed to do so. And the Ukrainians have been pushing them back. Now, if we can believe Syrskyi, so assuming Syrskyi is telling the truth and everything is correct there, and the Russians are withdrawing troops, I guess it depends whether they are going to try and hold on to the rest of this land, or whether they will just pull out fully from here and go back to the border. And if so, that will clearly be some kind of defeat for the Russians, especially since they will not have achieved any of their objectives unless one of their objectives was to draw Ukrainian troops away from elsewhere to here. I mean, that clearly would have been a success. The Ukrainians have done that. They were forced to do that, but the troops that were pulled to this area have then subsequently beaten the Russians back so far, and might continue to do so. So it's rather like the ending for the Ukrainians here, where the Ukrainians were pushed back themselves, but that was always, I think, on the cards. Like I was saying at the time, yeah, it depends how long they're going to decide to hold this or hold on to this for. Will it become a negotiating chip, or would it be to draw forces away, and then those forces would be necessarily utilized to push the Ukrainians back, and the Ukrainians will eventually give that land back, but it would have cost the Russians a lot in doing so. So, like, the pushing out of the Ukrainians from here, for me, was never seen as a defeat. And I'm not trying to be cope here for the Ukrainians, but actually, literally, what are the objectives? Did you succeed with the objectives? And the objectives, as I said at the time, and going back and listen to my videos, were never to hold this forever, right? And I was quite surprised they held it as long as they did. But for the Russians, their objectives would be to take Sumy and hold it ad infinitum, really, maybe use it as a bargaining chip, as has been the case. So we've heard that Putin has said he would bargain this area and the two over here in Kharkiv, north of Kharkiv, the Vovchansk and Lipsy sectors here, and swap that for freezing the rest of the front lines and the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk, which is like an insanely bad deal. But that's what, he does want to use these as bargaining tokens. Now, the Ukrainians wouldn't accept that. Does he realize that Ukrainians wouldn't accept that? And do his commanders think, well, actually, what is the utility of us holding on to this area if it's going to lead to us losing more troops and having a defeat, but then pulling out will look like a defeat as well. So interesting to see where the Russians go from here. And it's also fascinating to see that this has been explicitly expressed by Syrskyi as a defeat for the Russians. Now, of course, there's going to be an element of PR here. He's going to want to sell his successes. This has been something of a success for the Ukrainians, given that it was looking a bit hairy for some time there. Although I think it would have been quite difficult for the Russians to get across that land that they were planning on, especially down into those forests. This would hopefully allow the Ukrainians then to redeploy some of their troops from Sumy to elsewhere on the front line too. But anyway, let me know what you think. Syrskyi has called this a defeat for the Russians. I would kind of agree that that makes sense, given all the context that I have explained here. But it's kind of semantics anyway. One man's defeat is another man's something else, whatever. Anyway, I just thought I would take you through that. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.